Live from Arlington, Virginia, this is Transport Topics Newsmakers, the digital interview series that gives you access to candid conversations between industry experts and a veteran reporter. Thanks goes to our sponsor, Fleet Locate by Spirion. Here's your host, Dan Ronan.
Welcome to the latest edition of Newsmakers Special Report from Transport Topics. I'm Dan Ronan. I'm honored to host these conversations with leading figures in the trucking, freight, and logistics industries. Today, we welcome Dan Cook to this edition in what will be our fourth show in our interview series. We know that the men and women in the trucking industry who keep the freight moving are doing the hard work. They're out there every day, and we salute their professionalism and the ability to get the job done. Before we begin our conversation with Dan Cook, I want to tell you that Spirion is our sponsor for Newsmakers, and their leadership has a short message that they would like to convey to all of you. So let's watch the message, and we'll be back on the other side with Dan Cook right after this.
They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In the transportation industry, it's worth countless dollars. How many times have you wished you had eyes inside your trailer when you're trying to prove or bill for detention? How many times have you sent a driver for a trailer only to find it's still loaded? With the breakthrough IntelliScan cargo sensing technology from Fleet Locate by Spirion, not only can you know with unprecedented accuracy when a trailer is loaded or empty, now you can see it, save it, and share it. In this age of smart trailer technology, IntelliScan raised the bar with advanced methods of detection, leveraging a proprietary combination of optical imaging and laser time of flight to achieve 99.9% accuracy in cargo detection. With IntelliScan, your Fleet Locate trailer management system reads the entire 53-foot trailer reliably and accurately in extreme environmental conditions and with varied and irregular load types such as soft cargo like carpet or paper. And now, the artificial intelligence and machine learning that reads your cargo now captures what it sees and arms you with what you need to combat detention and ensure trailer readiness. Protect your cargo, time, and drivers with Fleet Locate by Spirion's IntelliScan. Contact us at 800-557-1449. Spirion.com/trailer-management.
Now we welcome to Transport Topics Newsmakers Dan Cook. First, let me give you a little background about our guest. Dan is the principal and practice leader with the True North companies. He helps True North's clients develop risk-based strategies to reducing their risk on a long-term sustainable basis, primarily dealing with transportation strategies. Before joining True North in 2013, Dan had numerous executive positions in the insurance industry, leading teams in several states, as well as teaching continuing legal education. And we welcome Dan to Newsmakers. Dan, it's good to have you with us. You know, the trucking industry is facing numerous challenges regarding insurance and these so-called nuclear verdicts with juries of $10 million or more. Fleet's very concerned about the cost of insurance continuing to escalate and insurance becoming more difficult to obtain. Is that the mantra for these days, that for the trucking industry, it will be a case of pay more and you get less?
Well, first, Dan, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your viewership and hope people are able to take away something of benefit today. To answer your question, I'd say in part yes. But you know, we need to take a hard look at what's driving both the cost increase and the reduced insurance capacity that's available to motor carriers. So let me answer your question first. It is true. We are not only seeing motor carriers pay more for that portion of the risk that they're transferring to their insurance carrier partners, but oftentimes they're also having to retain more risk. And that retained risk, Dan, is both, to their P&L, where they're paying those costs out of their operating account. And it's also added risk to the balance sheet or the long-term viability of the company. You know, at the operating level, we're seeing motor carriers often having to increase their retentions or their deductibles to keep premium increases down to a point that they can absorb. At the same time, at the other end, the catastrophic level, we're seeing those same fleets and others unable to purchase or having to cut back upon the amount of excess insurance that they need and want to carry to protect their business and the commuting public. So there's this general reduction in capacity, which is contributed to the situation really of less coverage and more cost.
So what do you tell your clients when you're talking with them about insurance issues? And I'm sure that very quickly into the conversation, this issue of nuclear verdicts gets in there. What do you tell them? What do you say for them to be doing? What are the top 3 or 4 things that you, as someone who knows the insurance industry pretty well, what do you tell these folks?
Well, first of all, in my 31-year career, there has never been a more important time to have an active focus on safety and compliance. And fortunately, while safety has always been core to the trucking industry, it's even become more elevated in importance. And we're seeing motor carriers really starting to compete on their ability to manage risk and the cost of risk for freight. And what I mean by that is, you see fleets are differentiating themselves to shippers and on a cost basis by managing and financing risk more effectively than their competitors. So that requires, in my opinion, a proactive operational safety approach that is both documented and known by everyone in the organization. That's really your first line of defense. That commitment to safety, then, it really starts with driver selection and training. And that's kind of basic 101 stuff. But as you think about it in the context of your ability to defend your position in the event of a suit occurring, the drivers that you chose to trust with your equipment and put on the road are at the core of your safety strategy. The days of putting butts in seats just doesn't work, nor does the 3-hour onboarding prior to hauling their first load. Drivers are the lifeblood of the industry, and the fleets that can attract and retain the best drivers really, Dan, tend to have the best safety results, the fewest claims, and are best positioned to defend themselves at the time of loss. And then last, I comment specifically on those fleets that have an accident. You have to plan today for the accident that you're going to have tomorrow. And by plan, I mean you need to know exactly what each member of your team is going to do, who's responsible for what, and make sure that all members of your organization, particularly the drivers who are the lead point of contact, know what they're going to do when that acclaimance occurs. You have to educate your drivers on what to do at the scene of an accident.
Such as being, careful about what you say to law enforcement, being careful about how you interact with people, all those things. I remember back when in another job I had when I was with the bus association, they actually had their drivers, in some cases, they had a laminated card that they kept either in their shirt or they would keep it in their equipment, that if there was an accident, they had a script that they were to use in terms of what to say so they didn't stray off course.
That driver is the only person on the scene at the immediate moment that occurs that can document what occurred, can gather basic information about the witnesses that are in the area, to document what the road conditions were, to recall for the future, what they were thinking and going through at that moment in time. So it's really important that they're prepared for the event that they're trying to avoid when it occurs.
These days, too, with everybody carrying either an Android or a smartphone of some sort or another, and the camera function, I mean, one of the things the first thing I would do would be start taking pictures, start taking video. As you said, you're creating a visual record of what took place and having it available in real time.
Well, and the truck itself is going to tell a story. Right?
Absolutely.
The in-cab technology today captures a great deal of event data that's going to paint a picture about what occurred. but you have to put that data in context. And the driver is going to be in the best position to do that.
Another question I had, and you mentioned this before, and this concerned the issue of driver hiring and retention. There's been so much turnover within the industry, and companies are out there competing for the good drivers, the great drivers that are out there. So, that becomes an issue as well in terms of, making sure you get good drivers. But if you get a good driver and it's hard to hold them because they're being outbid for pay or a little better equipment, whatever it is, that creates a challenge for trucking companies, doesn't it?
It sure does. And we see our clients employing a variety of techniques to try to both retain and recruit drivers, but also develop drivers. There's added pressure today to utilize driving schools or maybe to operate a driving school. There's some impetus to recruit from the military or find alternative sources. But the reality of the situation is your best driver is the one you employ today. And so we're seeing many, many fleets put added emphasis on training up and developing the drivers that are within their population, and then providing them the type of work environment that would facilitate their staying. Drivers are smart. We don't always give drivers enough credit for, one, the important work they do, but also their understanding of their environment. If you're a good employer, if you care about them and they know you care, if you provide them quality equipment, honestly, if you're a safe fleet so that they're not unnecessarily getting stopped on the roadside, drivers, I think, factor a lot more into their decisions than maybe the general public's aware of.
Or the cost they're getting per mile to drive. As you said, if you're treated with respect and you feel as though your job has value to the company, you're more likely to stay, I would imagine.
That's right.
Dan, I've read one story that even low-risk motor carriers, in some cases, are experiencing 8 to 10% increases in their insurance costs. New carriers are seeing new entrants in some cases, or companies with so-so safety records are seeing increases of 30 to 40%. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think, Dan, those are fair generalizations, but the range of outcomes is even far greater. For those fleets that are purchasing considerable limits of excess coverage, there have been numerous instances of even more substantial increases. And remember, it's not just the change in rate, but more importantly, it's the change in that fleet's total cost of risk per mile. We really need to be able to differentiate, if you will, between the fixed costs and the variable costs. So for instance, from 2010 to 2018 or so, we saw an average cost of truck insurance increase from about 55 cents a mile to over 85 cents a mile. That premium increase is a true fixed cost to the motor carrier. But what if during that period of time, that fleet also took on a higher deductible? Those increasing costs that the motor carrier is now paying out of pocket add to their total cost of risk. And so you've got situations where the actual cost could actually be higher.
Yeah, if they're paying a higher deductible, their exposure is higher because if they have a case, they're going to have more out of pocket right off the top until they get past their deductible, and then their insurance company takes over the claim from there.
That's right. It's a delayed cost. It may not appear in your current financials because many claims can take multiple years to all settle. So the losses within your deductible may not be known in the current financial period. So you get kind of this trailing cost creep that can erode, profits and the ability to continue to invest in the fleet down the road.
We're talking to Dan Cook. He is with True North, and you're watching a special edition of Newsmakers from Transport Topics. I'm Dan Ronan. We're about 8 months now into the COVID-19 pandemic, Dan. The trucking industry has had some great wins because of the high-profile work that the men and women have been doing on the roads. Do you believe that when we do have lawsuits and we do have cases that are out there, that this pandemic could pay some long-term dividends, if you will, in terms of helping reduce some of these nuclear verdicts or maybe even some of the smaller verdicts?
I think it could pay some long-term dividends, but we got to work for it. If you think about, ATA's, core pillars, the second pillar is image. And there's a great deal of investment around the driver's image and promotion of the driver. And that work is absolutely critical. And I don't think necessarily there's enough members of the trucking community or those like our firm that benefit from the trucking community to get behind some of those image efforts that are so critical to our industry, particularly when it comes to defending nuclear verdicts. I mean, if you think about America's Road Team or Share the Road or any number of the ATA initiatives, those are fundamental industry activities that help tell the story of the driver. Right now in COVID, we hear it all the time. I think the general public all appreciates the work that truck drivers are doing, and we benefit from it, and we see it every day as parcels are delivered to our homes. Mm-hmm. The trick is going to be sustaining that benefit long term.
Dan, one of the things that is often discussed when we get down to this issue of nuclear verdicts concerns the plaintiffs, the plaintiff bar and the plaintiff lawyers and the like. There's been a lot of criticism of what the plaintiff attorneys are doing. Have they put a target on the trucking industry's back, in your judgment?
I don't think it's my judgment. I think it's a fact. I started my career as an underwriter 31 years ago for St. Paul Travelers, back at a time when they were the largest insurer of doctors and hospitals in the U.S. And I think many of us can remember back to the medical malpractice crisis of the early 90s, when in communities like the small one I grew up in northern Michigan, local family doctors were leaving the communities to go to a state where they could afford their medical malpractice insurance. And it started to build such a groundswell that we ultimately got tort reform in the area of medical liability. Many of the law firms and many of the young attorneys back in the 1990s that were in the plaintiff's bar working in medical malpractice are today targeting trucking companies. We have seen a significant flight of what I would call some of the top plaintiffs litigators and some of the best financed law firms in that space move from medical malpractice or move from products liability to trucking.
You don't have to go very far and find a billboard somewhere on a highway, a state highway or an interstate, if you will, that has a sign that says, injured in a trucking accident, call the Big Dog Law Firm or call whatever it is with an 809 number to solicit business. You don't have to go very far.
No, and I think people are starting to catch on to this a little bit, and I think it's going to take a concerted long-term effort to help the public realize that there's a correlation between those billboards and those practitioners and a cost to society. When someone driving down the road sees that billboard, they might equate to, the lottery. When I see that billboard, I think about somebody who is building a big house, flying on a company jet, riding on a yacht on the backs of injured people. It was not that long ago that trucking companies had an opportunity to contact someone that was injured and take care of them right away. And I would argue that these nuclear verdicts have limited the ability to do that, limited the ability of companies to step forward and take care of the injured people, which I think by and large most companies want to do. But when you've got plaintiffs' attorneys taking 30, 40, 50% of the proceeds away from that injured individual and their family to buy the next bigger boat, we've got a problem. And while there are good plaintiffs' attorneys that are helping people resolve reasonable disputes, I'm not seeing those guys on billboards.
So there have been a couple of high-profile wins, though, for the trucking industry for tort reform and some of the things that you keep talking about, Louisiana being most recent, a Democratic governor in that state, a Republican legislature. How do you duplicate this? And here's a case where bipartisan, both sides got together and found a way. So how do you continue that in Indianapolis or Springfield or Madison, Wisconsin, or any one of the state capitals where this battle is being fought?
I'm really glad you asked this question, because that is where the battle is not only going to be fought, it's where the battle is won. The concept of tort reform is a federal concept. And while I think the industry, with the cooperation of other industries, you'd be surprised how much engagement there is with other large trade associations around the country on this topic. And I think the industry, over an extended period of time, can get reform at the federal level. That said, the wins that can occur now happen in the local legislatures, and they happen in the local judgeships. It's critical that we're taking what we learn in states like Iowa, like the punitive damages win in Missouri, like what was accomplished in Louisiana, requiring a level of transparency that we've not been able to get when defending suits. And we teach other states how to do that. And you are seeing state association executives lead on this issue. And you're seeing the ATA support and lead on this issue. Examples are drafting model legislation on seatbelt matters, or on punitive damages, or on any variety of issues, and disseminating that model legislation to each of the state executives and providing them the advice and resources to help fight that fight at the state level.
So you're saying that's where the battle really has to be fought, is in the state capitals, at the hearings. That's where it really needs to be taken in terms of getting the victories, one state at a time, one locality at a time.
It is, and you know that the trucking industry is ideally suited for that. I mean, we are a grassroots organization. Oftentimes, trucking company is one of the largest employers in many of the communities that they operate from. They oftentimes are some of the higher paying jobs, and many trucking company executives take their responsibility politically seriously. So they're supporting their legislators. They know them. They will often visit them at the Capitol. And so we have the means uniquely to get the message to the legislators at the state levels.
And you're more likely to see your state legislator or state senator at a community event or at a school event that your kids or grandkids, maybe they attend the same school, or a church or some sort of social activity. You're much more likely to know them than you are a congressman who represents, 750, 800,000 people, or a senator who's representing an entire state.
That's very true. And while there's many transportation associations that do calls on Washington, and I've been on many of those, and there's many state associations that will try to go to DC to meet with their legislature, you can do that on a regular basis at your local capital and with your local representatives.
And it's probably a lot easier to get in to see your local state legislator up in, Boston, or a state capital anywhere, Providence or whatever the state capital is, than it is to catch them in their home office in Bowling Green when they're home on break.
And they want to hear from you.
Absolutely.
And they know, they more than those in Washington recognize that driver is a family member, is a breadwinner, is a supporter of their community, left that morning with the last thing on their mind to be in an accident. There's no professional truck driver that gets out on the road thinking, hey, I want to be in an accident today, or I want to injure someone. They're out on the road doing a job to support a family, to get back home safe. And your local representatives understand that. And somehow that type of message sometimes gets lost in Washington.
Dan, we were talking about Louisiana, and as you know, there's been quite an interesting story that my Transport Topics colleague Eric Miller has been reporting on concerning an organized crime ring that has been causing deliberate accidents that have been targeting trucks. There's been several indictments. There's been several guilty pleas. There's actually been what law enforcement believes to be a murder of one of the people who was cooperating with the authorities after his indictment. This is pretty serious stuff. Any thoughts on this?
It is serious stuff, and it's incredibly disturbing. But unfortunately, Dan, I can't tell you that it's unique purely to Louisiana, nor is it unique to New Orleans. I head up the national practice at True North, and unfortunately, I've seen these situations occur in different places around the country over a number of years. I do have to tell you, I am incredibly proud of the transportation companies that put their name on the line, the individuals that drove this effort, that stepped forward and pursued these actions against these individuals. It's critical that we stand up for ourselves and fight when we're right. What's sad and is finally being rectified is that the first 32 indictments were individuals that I believe probably had nothing to do with planning these events. They were the poor people that were encouraged by others to be in those cars, to sideswipe those trucks, to put their personal self at risk for money, to have, in some instances, unnecessary surgeries. And it wasn't until just last week that a plaintiff's attorney was indicted on charges. And I believe that's going to be the tip of the iceberg. I believe not only are there more professionals, more plaintiff's attorneys, and unfortunately medical professionals involved in this racket, I think you're going to see that there's more rackets that are occurring in and about that area, and we're going to see additional charges filed in the future.
Dan, we've got about 5 or 7 minutes left in our conversation. I want to get a couple of questions in before we wrap up this very informative call. Will technology such as cameras solve the problem when the cameras show that upwards of 75% of accidents are caused by, in most cases, the passenger vehicles? Are you telling those fleets that you work with, you need cameras and you need them now?
Yes and no. Cameras are a part of a solution. And they do, in the incident where the motor carrier is not at fault, which is 75 to 80% of the time, can help provide supporting evidence to that end. They also come with a considerable amount of risk. You know, we are getting so much information out of these tractors today.
They're almost like data recorders on airplanes now. We're getting to that point.
They are, and then you layer on top of that camera technology, and it can be overwhelming. And so the camera providers, some of them are employing artificial intelligence to filter down the incidents, and they're trying to provide a more modified or limited number of critical events to the motor carrier. But the motor carrier then at some level has information about events that occurred out on the road. And you can't have that information and not act on it. And so it's created a benefit of being able to identify when you're at fault and go take care of that individual right away, which is what we generally want to do. And and be able to identify when you should defend yourself. But you've got this added burden and significant additional costs now that you've got a lot of data coming at you that you've got to figure out how to filter. And then you've got a lot of training or follow-up activity that comes off that event data.
Dan, there's a well-read study out by ATRI that you and I have chatted about that says that there are a couple of key factors that impact the size of a verdict, the crash factors. Take a couple minutes to explain what they are.
Yeah, so a number of factors affect the size of the verdict, and principal among them, as we've seen, is the jurisdiction in which the event occurs. You know, I was taking a look back at a study from 2010 through 16 of nuclear verdicts, and literally they were all along the coast. You had a few around in the Great Lakes area, and then all of the rest of them were east, west coast, and across the bottom of our country. And there was really nothing in the middle, in the mid plains or in the heartland. And we've come to see that jurisdiction matters greatly. What also matters is the severity of the injury and who got hurt. And we've seen where you have children in the vehicle that verdicts tend to be a lot higher, as do generally settlements. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but it creates a different environment when the child is involved in the accident. There's an empathy. You know that you're going to have an uphill fight if you're the motor carrier, even if you're not at fault, when you get in front of a jury, because there is an empathy for that injury. And so it forces a different environment when trying to reach settlement on those claims.
Dan, we were talking before about being careful in an accident scene and the like, and I just want to, in the last couple seconds, I want to ask you two quick questions. What are some of the strategies you tell your clients to be careful about right after something happens, and then going forward when dealing with plaintiff attorneys, that if you say the wrong thing or you do something that you may have thought was a good idea at the time, it could make you more vulnerable to a larger verdict?
Well, first of all, ask yourself that question today before the claim occurs. What is your data going to look like? Where does your data live? Who's going to have access to it? You need to know that now, not when the claims occur, right? And then I advise clients to be very cautious with who you allow to represent your company. You need to have a designated individual that is your spokesman, that is trained, that has experience in this area to manage your message wherever it needs to go. Your driver has to be under very specific instructions what they are and are not allowed to do at the time of the accident. And that's got to be consistent. That's got to be uniform as part of your policy across the fleet.
Good advice. Last question. Are you optimistic that in the long term, the trucking industry, because this is going to be a long, hard slog, I would imagine, are you optimistic that there's changes coming and that the industry will, to one degree or another, be successful?
I am. I'm very optimistic. What I continually encourage people is to understand that we're in it for the long haul. Specifically, as it comes to tort reform, this didn't happen overnight. This uneven playing field that the plaintiffs' bar has been able to achieve, they worked at one judge at a time, one ruling at a time, one legislative victory at a time over the last 10 to 12 years. And I would say we let our guard down. It snuck up on us, and all of a sudden we saw a rapid acceleration in nuclear verdicts and in loss costs. So it's going to take time to fight the fight and to reverse the harm that's been done by the plaintiffs' bar. But if we stay diligent to the grassroots efforts, to the image campaigns, to working on wins where we can get them and duplicate them in other areas, we can make meaningful change over time.
Dan, you've been a great guest. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Dan. I've enjoyed it.
We want to thank Dan Cook with True North for joining us for this edition of Newsmakers here on Transport Topics. Coming up, we'll have more Newsmakers in the next few weeks, including a discussion next month with Colin Mooney. He is, the president of CBSA, where we will discuss highway safety and what the trucking industry has learned in these, yes, they are very unusual times. Again, we thank Dan Cook for this great insight that he provided today. I'm Dan Ronan with Transport Topics, and we always thank you for watching.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information on future episodes, visit ttnews.com. This has been Transport Topics Newsmakers.